The desert wind carried whispers of violence through White Oaks, New Mexico, in the summer of 1879, where fortunes were made in silver mines and lost in saloons, and where a young outlaw named Billy the Kid rode into town with no intention of becoming anyone's hero. But sometimes fate doesn't ask permission before it changes everything. Billy Bonney, known to most as Billy the Kid, guided his horse down the dusty main street of White Oaks with the easy confidence of a man who'd learned to read danger in the tilt of a hat or the position of a hand near a holster. At 20 years old, he'd already lived more lives than most men twice his age: cattle rustler, gunslinger, fugitive, and occasionally, when the mood struck him, something resembling a decent human being. He wasn't in White Oaks looking for trouble. He had business with a man named Charlie Bowdra about some horses that needed moving across the territory, the kind of business that happened in back rooms with whiskey and handshakes and no paperwork. The sun hung heavy in the afternoon sky, baking the wooden storefronts and turning the street into a ribbon of heat shimmer. Billy pulled his hat lower against the glare, his blue eyes scanning the town with practiced wariness. White Oaks was growing fast, silver money bringing in miners and merchants and all the parasites that fed on both, saloons on every corner, a new hotel going up on the east side, and enough tension in the air to make a smart man keep his gun hand free. He was halfway to the Silver King saloon when he heard the commotion, raised voices, laughter with a cruel edge, the kind of sound that made his jaw tighten even before he understood why. Billy had seen enough ugliness in his short life to recognize it by sound alone. He should have kept riding, should have minded his own business like any sensible outlaw would, but something in those voices, the jeering quality, the excitement of men watching something they knew was wrong and enjoying it anyway, made him rein his horse toward the town square instead. What he saw there stopped him cold. A crowd had gathered near the center of the plaza, maybe 30 or 40 men forming a loose circle around something Billy couldn't quite see yet. They were shouting, laughing, calling out numbers like they were at a livestock auction. Billy dismounted and pushed through the crowd, his hand instinctively checking the Colt revolver at his hip. The men gave way reluctantly, annoyed at the interruption until they saw his face, saw the way he carried himself, and decided maybe they didn't want to argue with this particular stranger. When Billy broke through to the front of the circle, rage hit him like a physical blow. In the center of the plaza stood a girl, maybe 18 years old, completely naked and shaking with humiliation and terror. Her long dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and she was trying desperately to cover herself with her hands while tears streamed down her cheeks. Beside her stood a man in his 50s, drunk and swaying, his face flushed red with alcohol and something uglier, greed maybe, or the kind of desperation that turned men into monsters. He was shouting at the crowd, slurring his words but making his intention horrifyingly clear. He was selling his daughter's virginity to the highest bidder, and he'd stripped her naked in the town square so the buyers could see exactly what they were paying for. The girl's eyes were squeezed shut, her whole body trembling, and Billy felt something cold and furious settle in his chest. He'd killed men before, some who probably deserved it, and some who probably didn't, but he'd never felt the kind of pure, clarifying anger that he felt looking at this drunk bastard selling his own child like livestock. Billy didn't think, didn't plan, just acted. He stripped off his long duster coat as he strode forward, and before anyone could react, he'd wrapped it around the girl's shoulders, covering her nakedness. She gasped and opened her eyes, green eyes wide with shock and confusion, and Billy positioned himself between her and her father, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Auction's over," Billy said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the suddenly silent plaza. The drunk man blinked at him stupidly, trying to process this interruption. "The hell you think you're doing, boy? This is my daughter, my property, and I'll do what I damn well please with her." Billy's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made several men in the crowd take a step back. "Your daughter's a human being, not property, and if you try to sell her again, I'm going to put a bullet in you and sleep just fine tonight." The man's face twisted with drunken rage. "You got no right at all. She's mine. I raised her, fed her, and now she's gonna pay me back for all them years." He lunged forward, trying to grab the girl, and Billy's gun was in his hand so fast it seemed to appear there by magic, the barrel pressed against the drunk's forehead before he'd taken 2 steps. The plaza went dead silent. Even the drunk froze, some survival instinct penetrating the alcohol fog enough to tell him he was a heartbeat away from dying. Touch her again, and it'll be the last thing you ever do," Billy said softly. Behind him, the girl clutched his coat around herself, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, please don't kill him. He's still my father." Billy didn't take his eyes off the drunk, didn't lower his gun. "Your father's a piece of shit who deserves killing." "I know," she said, and there was something in her voice, not pleading exactly, but a kind of exhausted resignation that hit Billy harder than any argument could have. "But if you kill him here, the sheriff will hang you, and then what happens to me?" It was the practicality of it that got through to him. The clear-eyed assessment from a girl who'd just been stripped naked and sold in a public square, but still had the presence of mind to think about consequences. Billy slowly lowered his gun, though he didn't holster it. "What's your name?" he asked without turning around. Sarah Calloway." "Well, Sarah Calloway, how do you feel about leaving this town right now?" "I'd like that very much." The crowd was starting to murmur now, some men angry at being cheated of their entertainment, others uncomfortable with what they'd been watching, and relieved someone had stopped it. Billy could hear boots on wooden boardwalks, more people coming to see what the commotion was about, and he knew they had maybe 2 minutes before the sheriff arrived. "Can you ride?" Billy asked. "Yes." "Then let's go." He grabbed her hand and pulled her through the crowd, which parted more readily now that guns were involved. His horse was where he'd left it, and Billy swung into the saddle before pulling Sarah up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, still clutching his coat closed, and Billy kicked the horse into motion just as he heard someone shout, "That's Billy the Kid! Someone get the sheriff!" They thundered out of White Oaks, heading north into the broken country, where Billy knew every canyon and hiding place, where he'd spent the last 2 years staying one step ahead of the law, and various men who wanted him dead. Behind them, Sarah's father was screaming curses and threats, his voice fading as they put distance between themselves and the town. Billy didn't look back, just rode hard for 20 minutes until they reached a narrow canyon he'd used before, a place where water seeped from the rock and a few scraggly trees provided shade. He helped Sarah down from the horse and finally got a good look at her. Even with tear-streaked cheeks and tangled hair, even wrapped in a coat 3 sizes too big, she was striking, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and those startling green eyes. But what caught Billy's attention was the way she held herself, not broken despite what had just happened, but coiled tight like a spring under pressure. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for what you did back there." Billy shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable. Couldn't just ride past that. Most men did. Most men were bidding. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. Billy didn't have an answer for that, so he busied himself with his horse, loosening the saddle and checking the animal's legs. Sarah sat down on a flat rock, pulling the coat tighter around herself. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait until dark, then figure out where you want to go. You got family somewhere? Friends?" Sarah laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "My mother died when I was 12. My father's been drinking himself to death ever since, and today he decided to speed up the process by selling me. So no family, no friends, nowhere to go." Billy turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw something he recognized, the particular kind of loneliness that came from having nobody in the world who gave a damn whether you lived or died. He'd been carrying that loneliness since he was 15, and his own mother had passed, leaving him to fend for himself in a territory that ate up orphans and spit out outlaws. "You can stay with me for a while," Billy heard himself say, "until we figure something out." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're Billy the Kid," I heard them say it. "You're wanted by the law." "That's true. So why would you help me? What do you want?" It was a fair question, the kind of question a girl learned to ask after her own father tried to sell her virginity. Billy met her gaze steadily. "I don't want anything except to make sure you don't end up back in that plaza. You can leave whenever you want, go wherever you want, but until then, you're under my protection, such as it is." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "All right, thank you, Billy. Just Billy, none of that the kid nonsense." For the first time, something almost like a smile touched her lips. "All right, just Billy." They stayed in the canyon that night, Billy giving Sarah his bedroll while he sat watch with his back against a rock and his rifle across his knees. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable, just two people who'd both learned that sometimes quiet was safer than words. When dawn broke, Billy shot a rabbit and cooked it over a small fire, and they ate in continued silence. Sarah still wrapped in his coat because she had literally nothing else to wear. "We need to get you some clothes," Billy said finally. "There's a trading post about 10 miles west, run by a Navajo woman who doesn't ask questions. We can get you fixed up there." Sarah nodded, but before they could move, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Billy was on his feet instantly, rifle ready, positioning himself between Sarah and the canyon entrance. A single rider appeared, and Billy relaxed slightly when he recognized Charlie Baudra, the man he'd originally come to White Oaks to meet. "Billy," Charlie called out, reining his horse to a stop. "You got yourself into a hell of a mess, boy. Story of my life. What's the situation in town?" Charlie dismounted, his expression grim. "That girl's father went straight to Sheriff Garrett, tried to get him to form a posse to hunt you down for kidnapping." Billy's jaw tightened. And Garrett told him to go to hell, said half the town saw him trying to sell his own daughter, and if he didn't want to be arrested himself, he'd best keep his mouth shut and count himself lucky. Some of the tension left Billy's shoulders. Pat Garrett was no friend of his. They'd been on opposite sides too many times for that. But the sheriff was a fair man in his own way, and apparently even he had limits to what he'd tolerate. "So we're clear. From the law, maybe, but there's more." Charlie glanced at Sarah, then back to Billy. "The father, Calloway. He left town last night. Word is he rode out to find the Dalton gang." Billy felt his blood run cold. The Dalton gang wasn't really a gang in the organized sense. It was more like a collection of the worst men in the territory, murderers and rapists and thieves who'd been thrown out of every other outlaw group for being too vicious, too unpredictable. They operated out of a camp somewhere in the Badlands east of White Oaks, and they numbered at least 50 men, maybe more. And their leader, a man named Jacob Dalton, was known for two things: his skill with a gun and his complete lack of anything resembling human decency. "What's Calloway offering them?" Billy asked, though he already knew the answer. Charlie looked at Sarah again, uncomfortable. "He's offering Dalton the girl in exchange for killing you." Sarah made a small sound, not quite a gasp, and Billy saw her face go pale. "My father made a deal with murderers to kill the man who saved me and to give me to them instead." "That about sums it up," Charlie said quietly. Billy's mind was racing, calculating odds and options. 50 men, maybe more, all of them killers, all of them hunting for him and Sarah. They couldn't outrun that many, couldn't hide forever, and he couldn't fight them all alone. "We need to leave the territory," Billy said. "Head south into Mexico, disappear for a while. They'll track you," Charlie warned. "Dalton's got Apache scouts working for him. They'll follow your trail all the way to Mexico City if they have to." "Then what do you suggest?" Charlie hesitated. "I suggest you take the girl and run as far and fast as you can, and I suggest you do it now, because Dalton and his men left their camp this morning, and they're headed this way." Billy looked at Sarah, who was staring at the ground, her hands clenched into fists. "Sarah." She looked up, and he saw something fierce in her eyes, something that hadn't been there yesterday. "I'm not running. I'm not spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder because my father's a monster. If they're coming, let them come." "There's 50 of them," Billy said carefully. "I don't care if there's 500. I'm done being afraid. I'm done being a victim." She stood up, letting Billy's coat fall open slightly, not caring anymore. "You saved me yesterday. Now let me help save you." Billy felt something shift in his chest, a kind of recognition. This girl had been pushed past her breaking point and come out the other side harder, sharper, dangerous in her own way. He'd seen it happen before, seen people transform when they finally decided they'd rather die fighting than live running. "All right," Billy said slowly. "But we do this smart, Charlie. Where's the nearest defensible position?" Charlie thought for a moment. "Old Mission Church about 5 miles north, stone walls, good sight lines, water well inside the compound." "That'll do, Sarah. Can you shoot?" "My father taught me before he started drinking I can shoot." Billy handed her his spare revolver, a Colt .45 that looked too big in her hands, but which she handled with surprising confidence. "Then let's go make things difficult for Mr. Dalton and his friends." They rode hard for the mission, arriving just before noon. The old Spanish church had been abandoned for decades, its roof partially collapsed and its walls pockmarked with bullet holes from some long-ago battle, but the stone was thick and solid, and the compound had a wall that would provide cover. Billy and Charlie spent the next hour preparing, moving supplies inside, checking ammunition, finding the best firing positions. Sarah watched and learned, asking questions, helping where she could, and Billy found himself impressed by her composure. Most people would be falling apart right now, but Sarah Calloway had apparently used up all her fear yesterday in that plaza. By mid-afternoon, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Riders, lots of them, coming fast. Billy counted at least 40 men, maybe more behind them, all armed, all riding like they had murder on their minds. "Here we go," Charlie muttered, checking his rifle. Billy positioned Sarah behind a thick section of wall with a clear field of fire. "Don't shoot until I do. Make every bullet count, and if things go bad, there's a horse saddled by the back gate. You run and don't look back." Sarah met his eyes. "I'm not leaving you." "Sarah," I said, "I'm not leaving you. We do this together or not at all." There wasn't time to argue because the Dalton gang was spreading out, surrounding the mission, and Billy could see Jacob Dalton himself riding at the front, a big man with a scarred face and dead eyes. Dalton reined his horse to a stop about 100 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. "Billy Bonney," he shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "You got something that belongs to me. Send out the girl, and maybe I'll let you die quick." Billy stepped up onto the wall where Dalton could see him. "The girl doesn't belong to anyone, and if you want her, you're going to have to come through me." Dalton laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "That can be arranged, boys. Burn them out." The gang opened fire, a thunderous volley that sent bullets smashing into the stone walls and whining through the air. Billy, Charlie, and Sarah returned fire, and Billy had the satisfaction of seeing 2 men fall from their saddles before the gang pulled back out of range. "They're going to try to wait us out," Charlie said, reloading. "We've got water but not much food, maybe 2 days' worth." Billy nodded grimly. 2 days wasn't enough. Dalton could afford to wait a week if he had to, and eventually they'd have to make a break for it or starve. But then something unexpected happened. More riders appeared on the horizon, coming from the direction of White Oaks, and these riders were wearing badges. Sheriff Pat Garrett rode at the head of a posse of maybe 20 men, all armed, all looking like they meant business. Dalton saw them too and wheeled his horse around, confused and angry. Garrett rode straight up to Dalton, fearless, and Billy could hear his voice even from a distance. "Jacob Dalton, you and your men are under arrest for disturbing the peace, destruction of property, and attempted murder." Dalton's laugh was ugly. "You got no jurisdiction out here, Garrett. This is open territory." "Maybe so, but you boys rode through White Oaks this morning, shot up the saloon, killed 2 men, and terrorized the whole town looking for Billy Bonney. That gives me all the jurisdiction I need." Billy felt a cold satisfaction. Dalton had been so focused on finding him and Sarah that he'd gotten sloppy, had let his men run wild in town, and now Garrett had legal cause to come after them. "I got 50 men, Garrett. You got 20. Do the math. I got 20 deputies and the law on my side. You got 50 murderers and rapists who'll scatter the second things get hot, so why don't you do the math?" For a long moment, nobody moved, the 2 groups of riders facing each other while Billy, Charlie, and Sarah watched from the mission walls. Then Dalton made his move. His hand dropped to his gun, and Garrett was faster, his revolver clearing leather and firing in one smooth motion. Dalton jerked in his saddle but didn't fall, and suddenly everyone was shooting, the Dalton gang firing at Garrett's posse, the posse firing back, and complete chaos erupting across the desert. Billy saw his chance. He vaulted over the wall and ran toward the fight, Sarah right behind him despite his shouted protests. They hit the Dalton gang from the side, Billy's guns blazing, and the gang found themselves caught between Garrett's posse and Billy's fury. Men were falling, horses screaming, dust and gun smoke filling the air until Billy could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He caught sight of Dalton, wounded but still fighting, trying to rally his men, and Billy ran straight at him. Dalton saw him coming and raised his gun, but Sarah was faster. She fired from behind Billy, and her bullet took Dalton in the shoulder, spinning him around. Billy closed the distance and slammed into Dalton, both men going down in a tangle of fists and fury. They rolled in the dust, each trying to get a hand on a weapon, and Billy felt Dalton's fingers close around his throat, squeezing, cutting off his air. Black spots danced in Billy's vision, and he thought absurdly that after everything, he was going to die in the dirt at the hands of a man whose name he'd barely known yesterday. Then a gunshot cracked right next to his ear, deafening, and Dalton's grip went slack. Billy shoved the dead weight off him and looked up to see Sheriff Garrett standing there, his smoking revolver pointed at where Dalton's head had been. "Figured you could use a hand," Garrett said dryly. Billy coughed, gasping for air, and managed to nod. Around them, the fight was ending, the Dalton gang was breaking, men throwing down their weapons or fleeing into the desert, and Garrett's posse was rounding up the survivors. Sarah appeared at Billy's side, helping him to his feet, her face smudged with gun smoke, but her eyes bright with something that might have been triumph. Garrett looked at her, then at Billy, and shook his head. "You got a talent for finding trouble, Bonnie." "Wasn't looking for it this time, Sheriff." "Never are," Garrett said. But there was something almost like respect in his voice. "Town's grateful, you know, for what you did yesterday, stopping Calloway, and for leading these bastards out here where we could deal with them instead of having them shoot up White Oaks again." Billy blinked, surprised. "You saying I'm not under arrest?" "I'm saying that officially, I rode out here to stop the Dalton gang from terrorizing the territory, and when I arrived, they were already engaged in a gunfight with persons unknown, and by the time the smoke cleared, their leader was dead and the rest had scattered. I never saw Billy the Kid at all." Garrett's expression was carefully neutral. "Unofficially, I'm saying you got about a 10-minute head start before I remember that there's still a warrant out for you, so if I were you, I'd use that time wisely." Billy understood. Garrett was giving him a chance, payment for helping defend the town and for doing the right thing with Sarah. "What about Calloway?" Sarah asked, her voice hard. "What about my father?" "Thomas Calloway is currently in my jail," Garrett said, "charged with attempted sale of a human being, conspiracy to commit murder, and being a general disgrace to humanity. He'll be tried, convicted, and spend the rest of his miserable life breaking rocks in a territorial prison." Sarah's face showed no emotion. No sadness, no relief, just a kind of cold satisfaction. "Good." Garrett tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am, you ever need anything, you come find me. Any daughter of Thomas Calloway deserves better than what you got." "I'm not his daughter anymore," Sarah said quietly. "Not in any way that matters." Garrett nodded, understanding, then turned back to Billy. 10 minutes, Bonnie. I suggest you start riding." Billy grabbed Sarah's hand and they ran for the horses. Charlie was already mounted and holding the reins of Billy's horse and the one they'd saddled for Sarah. They swung into their saddles and kicked the horses into a gallop, heading south toward the border, toward Mexico, toward whatever future they could carve out for themselves. Behind them, Sheriff Garrett watched them go, made no move to follow, just stood there until they disappeared into the heat shimmer, then turned back to his men and the grim work of dealing with the dead and captured. Billy and Sarah rode for hours, not stopping until they were well clear of New Mexico territory, until the sun was setting and painting the desert in shades of red and gold. They made camp in a small canyon, and for the first time since the Plaza in White Oaks, they had a moment to breathe, to think, to feel. "What now?" Sarah asked, sitting close to the fire Billy had built. Billy looked at her, this girl who'd been stripped and sold and hunted, who'd faced down 50 killers and come out the other side, who'd saved his life when Dalton had him by the throat. "Now we figure out how to live," Billy said. "Together if you want." Sarah smiled, a real smile this time, the first he'd seen from her. "I want." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow made something good out of it. Billy knew they'd carry the scars of what happened. Sarah would always remember that Plaza, and he'd always remember the rage he'd felt seeing her there, but scars were just proof that you'd survived, that you'd fought and won. And sometimes, in a territory as hard and unforgiving as the American West, survival was the only victory that mattered. They'd head to Mexico, maybe find a small town where nobody knew their names, where Sarah could be just Sarah and Billy could be just Billy, where they could build something that looked like a normal life, or at least their version of it. It wouldn't be easy, nothing ever was, but they'd face it together. And that made all the difference. As the fire burned down to embers and the desert night wrapped around them, Billy reached out and took Sarah's hand. She squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was a promise that whatever came next, they'd face it side by side, two survivors who'd found something worth surviving for. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still unforgiving, but for Billy, Bonnie, and Sarah Calloway, it was also full of possibility, and that was enough. So what did you think of this story? Give it a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments below, and let us know what you thought of Billy and Sarah's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. It helps us bring you more stories of courage, survival, and unexpected heroes from the frontier. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.